My mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer, which kind of just like turned my whole life upside down. I'd never really been exposed to kind of like terminal illness in that way, and also not like being a family caregiver like I became. And so it was that whole experience of just trying every day to figure out like how could I be there for my mom, how could I help her, how could we make sure that she didn't have pain, that she didn't have all of these symptoms, and that she just had like the best sort of end to her life that she could have.
How were you supposed to know?
It wasn't. That's the problem, right? Like you aren't supposed to know anything, because like most family members or friends who take on these responsibilities, like how could we know like what we're supposed to do? And that is a little bit the challenge, that you're figuring things out as you're doing it. If you're diagnosed with more of a progressive illness or terminal illness, which could include Alzheimer's, dementia, maybe you are diagnosed with like a terminal cancer that's quite aggressive, like the journey is like so individual, but it just requires like very different things from both the patients and the family members, because you need to come to terms with what is happening.
How can you do that?
Yeah, so having these conversations within the family, it's really important. And quite often, like, it won't be a one-off conversation. It will probably be extremely hard to have them. And it probably will be like a series of conversations where you will be covering like certain topics at a time. And we had many conversations personally. There were also many conversations that we didn't have that I kind of wished in hindsight that we had had. For example, one thing was like about almost like our role as family caregivers, because it also takes a while for many people to kind of accept a bit that role. It's just so important to be able to like have these conversations, not only like when someone is sick, but also more when someone in your circle is going through something like this. So I think anything that we as a society can do together to just like break down a bit of these taboos and like talk about serious illness and death and dying and also grief and everything that comes after. If we can like talk about that a bit more openly, I do think that just makes it easier for people, and it also does make it easier for doctors to help people, and I think it will have a lot of very positive effects.
I never knew exactly why podcasters asked me to subscribe. It turns out it's all about the algorithm. Subscriptions, comments, and likes help this channel get noticed by new people. Reaching more people can build an audience, which makes a podcast financially sustainable. That means I can spend more of my time improving this show, and I have many ideas on how to do so. Please help me get there by clicking subscribe. Thank you very much. We live in some of the most medically advanced societies historically. We can cure cancer, a lot of type of cancers. We can transplant organs or do robotical operations from thousands of kilometers away. Yet, when serious illness enters someone's life, we often feel very unprepared. In an aging Europe, in the meantime, more and more people live with illnesses like cancer, dementia, or heart disease, and they very often don't get the complex support that they need. Family members often become caregivers, decision makers, or even nutritionists, while still trying to cope with the diagnosis. So today we are asking the questions, how do we deal with serious illness in Europe, and what needs to change? Joining me in this conversation is Nara Moripen. Nara is an entrepreneur, the founder of POL, an application that helps people manage serious illness and palliative care. Nara, thank you very much for being here. And can we please start by you explaining a little bit your journey into this space and what led you to build POL?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. I love being a guest here. Yeah, my journey into PAL was actually quite straightforward in many ways, and in other ways not. Pretty much like in my previous life before starting the company, I was working in healthcare as a consultant, primarily working with pharma companies on digital health innovations. So it was a lot of work on like making sure that patients had support that they needed. So in some ways not so different from what we do at PAL, at least like the underlying things. And while I was still in that job, then my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer, which kind of just like turned my whole life upside down. I'd never really been exposed to kind of like terminal illness in that way, and also not like being a family caregiver like I became. So it was that whole experience of just trying every day to figure out like how could I be there for my mom, how could I help her, how could we make sure that she didn't have pain, that she didn't have all of these symptoms, and that she just had like the best sort of end to her life that she could have. And that was the inspiration for PAL, where I just wanted to give better support to other people in like my situation and my mom's situation in the future, to just like have a little bit more of like empowerment and like take back a little bit of control into your life in that kind of situation.
First of all, very sorry to hear about your mom. Unfortunately, I have similar experience with my father. What exactly does PAL do? So what is the solution that you are building?
It's essentially a solution that helps anyone with a serious illness get better support, ideally in their own home, because most people prefer to stay at home as much as possible in that time in their lives. So it consists of an app that supports patients with a serious illness, family members or friends, any loved one that wants to support, with active tools and support that they can benefit from in their own daily life. So that can be anything from a family care planner that helps you kind of just like ease the care burden on people and share a bit like the care burden amongst family members. We help with symptom management so that people can stay more on top of their symptoms and other things that are influencing their well-being so that they can take action, whether that is to do something themselves or to request better support from their healthcare team. And we give them a lot of access to resources and support and services that are very practical in nature and that can help them with very like specific things that they need, whether that is symptom management or care needs and so on. And then on the clinician side, we connect the data that we're collecting, where we are sort of translating that into clinical needs, and we're sharing that in real time with clinicians so that they can actually act sooner and help patients when they need it, and not just wait for the patients to call in panic at 2 a.m. or for the patients to show up at the emergency room where things are kind of like all ready to progress. So that is what PAL is in a nutshell.
I assume that most of this is basically solutions to problems that you have found in your own caregiving or serious illness journey, as well as other people's. I know that all of these journeys are a little bit different, but I also see a lot of similarities, right? So I'm curious to dive really into what does this patient journey look like right now, and what are the problems and potential solutions to those problems. So could you help me dive into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite complex. And like you said, like, I think there's actually like so many similarities, which is actually a bit of a paradox almost. It's not like this is a local problem where it's like only a problem in Amsterdam, for example, to get like this kind of support. It's like throughout Europe and really like across also like socio-demographic challenges and like all of these things. So it really is something that influences people across conditions and everything. But there are a few kind of themes that I would say are quite important and that are influencing people. So the first one would be more around like the actual condition and dealing with more like physical and like medical and clinical challenges. Then you also have more like emotional and spiritual challenges that may not be like equally important, because we see that a lot of people really like tend to worry more about like symptoms and the medical, and then they kind of put their own needs and worries a little bit aside, but it's still like a really big challenge. And then you have everything that kind of has to do with more like practical concerns and like administrative, like paperwork, like insurance, all of these things, and financial aspects, which can also really like just make things worse. And all of these coupled, like when you're not really able to help people across these different like groups of challenges, it can also influence like their medical success and their outcomes and like how well they're doing. So if someone has like financial stress, that can actually influence you a lot, like with your cancer treatment, just because it's something that just like then takes away from your ability to feel better. When we started building PAL, obviously my personal experience was a bit like that was the starting point for us. But me and my co-founder Asi, we kind of wanted to just like get rid of all of the bias that I might have, but we didn't want to assume that my experience was like representative in any way, like maybe it was completely different. So we kind of scrapped that and then just talked to over 100 people with different kinds of conditions, different places in Europe, just to really like dive deeper into their challenges. And then we got confirmation that a lot of my challenges were not unique in any way. They were really things that people were bothered by on a daily basis. But we also asked them to rank these challenges. What was common was that absolutely everyone kind of had problems with all of these different groups. But when it came to the more like medical symptom management, things like seeing your loved one in pain, this was really something that was like at the top of the pyramid in terms of their needs. So, for example, for caregivers, we know that a lot of them have a lot of stress. I felt that caregiver burden myself, with kind of like having to try to figure everything out trying to become a nurse almost without any form of education or support, and kind of doing this next to my job. But all of those kind of concerns and that stress and that burden became quite secondary when I saw my mom in pain, when I saw that she was like at risk of different complications, when we had to go to the emergency room, like then it kind of didn't matter anymore. And that was one of the things that was really true across the board, that people are really like mostly concerned with just making sure that the patients have a good quality of life. That's really like at the center of the need pyramid.
I have so many questions about actually the whole journey, but two things I would like to ask before. One is very technical. So you talk about serious illness. That's the term that you use. What exactly do you mean by serious illness?
We use it quite a lot for someone with like a more physical condition where they have like a symptom burden. It's quite often progressive, meaning it will get worse. In many cases, you can treat it, but like with many cancers, but in other cases you cannot, and it will consistently get worse. And you also often have like complex care needs and things that just span beyond your illness. So you mentioned already in your intro a couple of examples like cancer, neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia, and so on. Also things like advanced organ failure, like COPD. There's a really big bucket of these more like physical illnesses that a tool like PAL can help. But in addition, you also have other conditions that often can lead to like a lot of sick leave and like time off from work, like serious mental illness and also other conditions. So it is a very, very broad term that we are just using a bit loosely just to make sure that everyone sort of feels a bit included.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And indeed, it's so interesting. I think that it touches upon so many different aspects of a person's lives.
Yeah.
From work to family, finances, like literally everything.
Yeah.
The other question I wanted to ask is about your mother a little bit, because I also heard you in other places explaining your journey and talking about her, and perhaps one would feel a bit weird asking you about this in such a practical manner. Do you feel okay about talking about this experience? It kind of became part of your work and part of your story, right?
Yeah, like in one way, like I kind of don't have a choice, but it's also something that I've grown quite accustomed to talking about, so it's not really a problem. And also, while my mom was still with us, she was also very open about her illness, and we didn't really have many problems talking about it. I'm not saying like obviously there were some things that were more uncomfortable to talk to with her, but she was in general very open with both me and my sisters, and also with like other friends and family. So I think that has kind of also helped me kind of like while she was ill, we were kind of able to process a lot of it, so that by the time she passed away, I was already kind of like ready to talk about it as well, just because I had that whole period. So yeah, go ahead.
That's not very common though, right? For people to be able to talk so
No,
often.
it can be like we've obviously had a lot of conversations with people, and you really see the whole spectrum of like where I'm probably here, where I'm like extremely comfortable talking about it, even if it still hurts and was of course like a traumatic and sad experience. And then you obviously have people who kind of refuse to talk about it, and it's just too painful and raw for them. But we really see that it can also, like in many cases, help to talk about it. So it is a bit sad that we live in a society where, you know, it's not that often that you would ever ask someone about like the loss of a parent or someone in their lives. Like you will often not even talk to close friends about it. Now it's also been a few years since my mom passed away, and it's not that often that someone will ask me, like outside of my work, like, you know, how are you doing? Like, what was she like? And I do think that's a bit sad that we kind of have this whole like taboo around talking about people who have passed, and I think it can be quite like helpful for people to talk about the people they miss and the people who aren't around anymore.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I lost my father almost 7 years ago, and I actually really enjoy talking about him. A lot of people, I think, especially people who have not been through something like this before, including illnesses and grief, I think they assume that someone doesn't want to talk about it. And that, for me, it has actually been quite the other way around. And maybe it's similar for you as well, that I still feel like the people that I've lost are part of my life in a way, and my personality. And what I experience and now also see on myself is that people who have been through something similar, including caregiving, then approach this topic completely differently. So I now see myself calling my friends who I know are going through something like this more often than the same people from our friend group who haven't experienced this before. So I think it's interesting how once you know a little bit what it's like, I think you can become a better ally or support person in this as well.
It has changed me exactly the same way. Like, it's very easy for me now, having experienced that loss, to sit and kind of point fingers at people who kind of wouldn't show up for people in that way. But I was that way like 5-6 years ago, for sure. Like, I would have like had trouble talking about the subject. I would have assumed that people just don't want to talk about anyone that they've lost. You know, would have really struggled in those kind of situations. But do you feel like when you, for example, like bring up your dad in any situation, even if it's just like a light topic, do you experience that people are kind of getting a little bit like that they don't really want to talk about it? Or what has your experience been?
I think now less and less, but because so much time has passed, like it has almost been 7 years, and I've been like talking about him regularly, so people now feel and know, like I'm kind of setting the scene, I'm in control, because indeed, if I'm not, then I feel like the vibe becomes a bit awkward or weird, or but at the beginning I very much felt like that. And interestingly, was exactly the time when I had the need to talk more about him, right? So when it's still very fresh, it was constantly on my mind, and that's when I wanted to talk about it. And people felt very, just holding themselves back or a little bit awkward around it. I was, of course, also 20 at that point, so all my friends were also 20, 19, whatever. Of course, it's understandable that we didn't really have a way to approach this. Interesting that I wanted to talk about this more at the end towards our conversation, but of course it came up. But I think it's also good to mention this now, because a lot of people perhaps assume that if they are not dealing with serious illness right now, they don't really need to, or that it's not for them, conversations like this. Whereas I really believe that it's for everyone to know, because there either now or later there will be someone in their lives who is dealing with it, either as a patient or as a caregiver, and we can learn and improve, I think, so much as a society in learning how to support these people and how to approach this. Do you agree with that, or do you have some
100%. And it is sad, because most people will experience this, like you say. Like, probably we're all guaranteed to experience this at least once in our lives, and it is sad. But and also what I have reflected upon, because I've also had losses after my mom. And it's just sad that you actually become so much better at it with more people, and just in terms of kind of like handling it and like all the process, like you just know what the process is like in terms of things like funerals, but also just like handling that grief, even if it doesn't necessarily become more easy, but at least you know what you're walking into. And it's not easy the first time you're kind of experiencing that very like close loss, but unfortunately everyone will be experiencing it. And I do think it's better, like the more kind of open you are and the more prepared you are to kind of experience it. But I think it's not so easy to know how to do that until you kind of experience it yourself.
And it depends, I think, both on the individual but also on the environment, right? So it's really on, like, you're trying to be open, but for that you need the people and the space where you feel okay with being open and who can react, let's say, the right way. Not that there is one right way to react, although I'm curious if there is. And then if you are really talking about being more prepared eventually, or knowing more about the process or the journey, how does the journey actually look like? So I assume that it starts most often with symptoms or a diagnosis. At what point do you think that it really starts, or it becomes relevant, for example, for Paul to think of someone as a patient?
So the answer is like, it really varies by condition, because you have some conditions that kind of start out that they could still be considered serious. For example, I think any type of cancer would be considered quite serious, but not all cancers will be life-limiting or terminal, right? So the way that you would approach, a definitely curable cancer with very high survival rates, like excellent treatment options, you still need to go through all of the hardship of maybe chemo or immunotherapy or surgery or radiation, like all of those things. So it's still like very much a serious illness with a lot of complications for you. But your journey looks very different, because you will at some point be kind of returning to society in the same way as you were before. Although I do think it really changes people in terms of like survivors of illness as well. And you will just have different challenges in terms of like returning to work. Maybe you need to have some adaptations at work. Maybe your friends and family just won't really understand because like now you've gone through something very life-changing. Like you will still have all of those challenges, but still like your journey ahead just looks very different because you're more now like a survivor. Like you're dealing more maybe with some late effects of your treatment, and then of course the path or like your journey if you're diagnosed with an illness that is very progressive, maybe terminal from the offset, that obviously gives you very different challenges on your journey. If you're diagnosed with more of a progressive illness or terminal illness, which could include quite like illnesses that you quite often can live with for many, many years, like Alzheimer's, dementia. Maybe you are diagnosed with like a terminal cancer that's quite aggressive. Like the journey is like so individual, but it just requires like very different things from both the patients and the family members, because you need to come to terms with what is happening.
How can you do that? So if you are facing a diagnosis, maybe you expected it a little bit, maybe it's completely out of the blue. Like as a family member or as a patient, how do you feel that people cope with the diagnosis now? What is the support that they get?
Yeah.
And what would be a more ideal scenario, if you can say that, in such a situation?
Yeah. No, it's a bit challenging to talk about an ideal scenario, but for example, in our case, it was quite like out of the blue, like my mom's cancer diagnosis. Even if she had literally been a smoker her whole life and she was diagnosed with lung cancer. So that is probably a bit on us that, we as a family should probably have been a little bit more proactive with kind of sending her to the doctor and so on. But you live and you learn, and that's just a lesson I've learned. But in terms of just her symptoms, it was very, very sudden that she even started having symptoms. And we then went to her GP, and just the only thing he could see, apart from like her having kind of like a bit like flu-like symptoms, was high blood pressure. But that blood pressure was so high, we then got sent to the emergency room. And then they did tests, and I think very quickly, probably with an X-ray or something, they found out it was lung cancer. And then, of course, you have to go through, a bit depending on what kind of condition you have, whether you have cancer or something else, you obviously need to go through testing. So that whole diagnostic period, even if I think it's often described as kind of like just one period or episode in time, it can often drag on for really long. And that can also be extremely traumatic and difficult for people, because you have so many questions. You might be presented with like a cancer diagnosis or something else, and then you need to do the whole staging or understand like what kind of condition it is, and then you're ultimately presented with hopefully a treatment plan and maybe a prognosis if your doctor is actually giving you a prognosis. But in many cases, doctors don't even tell you like how serious something is, because a lot of doctors are also quite hesitant to have these conversations with patients, especially when you're talking about a very progressive or terminal illness, which also isn't good, but I understand completely why it's really hard to have these conversations. And once a patient has then been seen by multiple doctors, they might assume that a prognosis has been discussed. So that whole period from like diagnosis to potential staging to prognosis, like that can last really long.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in the meantime, someone is trying or kind of living their lives, right? Showing up at work, taking things seriously. And I also heard you mention it before, and I also have similar experience that your perspective just changes so significantly.
Yeah.
So the things that used to be really important,
they don't matter anymore.
From one point to another, it really seems like it doesn't matter. So how do you think that people can cope in that period? And in the meantime, you are, of course, also have more and more information maybe about the illness. These days you, I don't know, consult ChatGPT, like just trying to, you can get so much information in, even if it's not accurate. But I think that's also how people feel like they have a little bit of control. How do you think that are some coping mechanisms in this process?
Yeah. We really see that people deal with this in very, very different ways. Some are like me, where they want to just dig into all the information they can get their hands on, and they want every single question answered, and that's probably not necessarily healthy to go too far into it. I think like it's important to be informed and ask the right questions from your doctor, and of course that requires a little bit of research. But going all into Dr. Google and kind of Googling absolutely everything is also not very productive, I think. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who kind of dig their head in the sand and aren't really questioning or like asking anything and don't really want to come to terms with the diagnosis. And that can both be the person who's diagnosed, but also family members or loved ones. So I think like both of those ends of the spectrum are probably not the healthiest. But what we do see in terms of just the research we have done with patients and family caregivers is that being able to at least like prepare yourself enough that you can ask the right questions. And ideally, like then also getting information around like the chances of success with treatment, understanding the prognosis if there is a prognosis. All of those things can be really helpful for you long term to come to terms with it. That doesn't mean that you kind of need to have all of these this whole conversation in one go when you're presented with like the diagnosis. This can be kind of like over multiple conversations. But the more you know and the more you can kind of come to terms with even like a horrible life-changing diagnosis and prognosis can really make it easier for you down the line. Because how can you prepare if you don't know that, for example, this is in our case, we were presented with a terminal cancer with absolutely no treatment options. It was kind of immediately just to be able to like cope with symptoms and be able to kind of like shrink the tumor so that my mom could have a better quality of life. So she did get both chemo and radiation and so on. But it was all just life extending and to focus on her quality of life. It was never talks about any kind of curative treatment. And this was something that took me a really long time to come to terms with, because it just didn't sound true that in this day and age where, like you said, like you do have cures for everything, like how can you not have a cure for this? Or how can she have a prognosis that is, most likely like 1 year if she's lucky? Like this was really hard. But then again, if I hadn't kind of come to terms with that initially, it would have been very hard for me to show up and be there for my mom, and for us to also have all of those conversations and all the prep, which kind of then made the rest of her life better, where she had better quality of life, where I had a better quality of life, where we were able to make sure that she could have kind of like all the conversations and times with like us and friends and so on that she wanted, and where she could also have a good and dignified end to her life. And if we hadn't had all of that information up front, that whole thing would have been impossible. So there is a bit of a balance to find there.
So would you say it's quite crucial for someone to get an understanding somehow from their doctor, most likely, of the prognosis and the likeliness of success and the treatment?
Yeah, it is painful to ask those questions, and I understand why people don't want to have that information, but I really genuinely do think that will just make things better in the long run.
In many countries, it is actually somehow regulated that doctors are kind of required to tell patients if their illness is terminal. Do you know about how different it is in Europe and in different countries, if it's regulated or not?
Yeah, I do think that varies. I couldn't give you like all of the countries, but for sure, like there are some countries where it is more built into the culture in healthcare. But for example, we work a lot with the UK healthcare system, and there it is typically in the clinical guidelines that patients should be informed. But that doesn't mean that it's always done in clinical practice. And again, that doesn't mean that doctors are doing a bad job. It just means that sometimes there's just not a clear sort of communication, because like typically patients with serious illness will meet a lot of clinicians. So it might just not be clear that maybe the diagnosing doctor maybe didn't fully like communicate this. And there is also like a lot of, maybe it's not a taboo, but it is hard for doctors to have these conversations. So when you look at research where researchers have looked into what are the kind of like rates of physicians sharing this information, it's much lower than what it should be.
So it's basically, maybe the doctor is telling you, but it's highly encouraged for patients to ask for this information themselves, even if it's very uncomfortable. And then once you have an answer, you would, of course, also have an internal conversation more in the family about this, ideally, I assume.
Ideally, but this does not always happen. So maybe just to also give an example from our experience. So I mentioned earlier in the conversation that my mom was actually quite open about her condition and so on. But when we were kind of like in that diagnostic/prognosis phase, like then she was a little bit trying to, maybe just like protect us kids, because she obviously, even if you're like in your 60s, you still see your kids as, little kids. So she was trying to like protect us. So she initially actually didn't say anything about the prognosis, even if she got it from her doctor. But obviously it doesn't really take that much effort if you have the cancer type and a little bit about the staging. It doesn't take like an expert to find out what is the approximate prognosis, which is what I remember that I did. So I'm not sure if I remember ever talking to my mom about like the exact time prognosis that she had gotten, other than it being terminal and very serious. But back to your question in terms of like why I think it's so important, I just think like in general, like we just really see that you do have better outcomes as a family when you do have this conversation. It makes it impossible to, for example, start talking about their wishes towards the end, wishes for their funeral, what they want to do while they're still like up and, they still have like their functional, like their function and so on.
Because it's really not just the end, right? So I feel like often we talk about death immediately when we learn about an illness like this, but it can often take years, even 4 or 5, whatever years, and that can be spent in a high quality of life. So what are the positive outcomes that can come from a conversation, and what are perhaps some mistakes that one can make either during a conversation like this, which is incredibly difficult, or later in the period of giving care to someone, for example?
So having these conversations within the family, it's really important. And quite often, like, it won't be a one-off conversation. It will probably be extremely hard to have them. And it probably will be like a series of conversations where you will be covering like certain topics at a time. And it can be very confrontational. And I think what's also challenging is, unless like maybe the person who's sick is very active in terms of bringing it up, they might also be facing kind of like some pushback from the family, where the family kind of wants to pretend like things are okay, or you want to kind of keep up that like positivity and like let's think positive and not really come to terms with things. So it might just be like a series of conversations, but there are a lot of benefits and in actually having them. And we had many conversations personally. There were also many conversations that we didn't have that I kind of wished in hindsight that we had had. For example, one thing was like about almost like our role as family caregivers, because it also takes a while for many people to kind of accept a bit that role. I didn't really think of myself necessarily as a family caregiver, just like I'm there to support and I'll do whatever to help, which obviously is like the definition of one. But in terms of the conversations, we never really had like a proper conversation around sort of like our role as family members and what we were willing to do and what she was willing to kind of have us do. But we did manage to have conversations where we quickly understood that my mom obviously wanted to be at home as much as possible. We were probably a bit naive in terms of what that meant for us, because you obviously need a lot of extra support. And it's not like just because you have a serious condition that you get like a 24/7 nurse from day one. So that was something where we probably should have had a little bit more of a conversation. Maybe also like with a nurse or someone that could have guided us a bit.
Can you tell me more about that, actually? So what does it mean to be a caregiver? What are the challenges, or what is this role that someone is taking up? And what are some things that people don't assume in advance that they are going to have to do? And how can someone prepare for that role? Maybe also whether you should tell people around yourself that you are now a caregiver. I was recently in a workshop or something, and then you actually had to like form an identity, and then you had to talk about yourself a bit, like about your demographics and marital status, and it like you had to tick if you were a primary caregiver or not.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that was quite nice, actually, and it's not something that I often think about, for example, with my colleagues and thinking who's a caregiver. So long story short, my question is, who is a caregiver? What is the role exactly that they are taking on, and what are some things that they can or should do in their lives to make this a little bit more comfortable, easier for themselves?
The short answer is it can be anyone who supports you with anything. So it can be like driving your loved one to the hospital for like a checkup. It can be helping with like practical things like cooking meals, cleaning the house, just being there as like emotional support even can be caregiving. But it can also, and helping with like more administrative stuff like sending documents to the insurance or helping pay bills or all of these things. But it can also span more into where it kind of goes into more like medical, or at least like what maybe like a home nurse would do without the sort of like nurse background. And that is where, so I was very happy doing all of the other things. Like I would drive her to appointments. I would be like her advocate in meetings with the healthcare system. I would do research. I would do all of this. And also, of course, like help just like make sure the household was running and that she was well fed, and like, yeah, Googling like what should she eat to help with symptoms and all of these things.
It sounds like a full-time job, or at
It
least
was
a
pretty much a
part-time
full-time job on top of my day job. It was very intense, and of course, you don't have to be that involved in order to be a good support and a good caregiver. It doesn't have to be a full-time thing. It was more for me, like it turned into that, but it doesn't have to be. And we see this all the time where like maybe you have multiple people supporting you. Maybe the person who's sick doesn't need that kind of intense support. So it really just depends. But where I felt like it would have been helpful to have a conversation and also just know more about how that role can evolve was when my mom started getting more and more sick and started losing more and more function and needed more help with things like getting up, like going to the bathroom, like those kind of things. That's where we kind of met a bit of a barrier, where it started to not be like just like where I was more uncomfortable, both because I didn't really have the skill set to do it, but also just because you're then crossing a boundary where you're just not used to like having that kind of relationship. And that was also coincidentally when we then were able to actually get like more support from like home nurses, because she had then obviously like lost more function and she had kind of started entering a more different stage of her illness where she was then kind of like entitled to more support. So timing wise, like that ended up well, where I didn't have to have that kind of like nurse role. But if we had had that chat up front, I think both me and my mom would have then said, I'm not comfortable with you doing that. And I would say, I'm also not comfortable doing it. So then when that time comes, we should then all be comfortable having a home nurse to help with those things. So yeah, that would be like an example of a kind of conversation that you should have. But there's also a lot of other conversations. And I think for us, it was just like really having a lot of openness about like also her expectations of what she wanted towards the end. In terms of being at home, she preferred to die at home, which some people do, some people don't. And you can also change your opinion. But it just helped us constantly having that as sort of like our goal a bit in mind. Everything we do, like we will kind of sacrifice ourselves a bit to make sure that she can stay at home and that she can hopefully have a nice, dignified death at home, and that she will be able to like have conversations with the people she wants to speak with before she passes. And also that we were just able to have conversations about important things and that we were kind of aware of the time that we had left. And my mom pretty much planned her whole funeral. And that just like really, like I'm not saying everyone should be comfortable enough to plan their own funeral, but it was quite nice knowing that she had quite like strong opinions about it. And we had that conversation, and then we could kind of just go and sort of, follow her steps. So these were the things that mattered to her and us. And these things will matter, different things will matter to different families. But just like having the conversation about the topics that matters is really, really important.
It sounds like you have done a lot of things kind of the right way, according to if there is a right way.
I'm leaving out the bad things. There were also, I think this is like the benefit of time. Like you kind of forget the things that.
Are there a few key mistakes that someone can make or someone should avoid?
One thing that I did really poorly was kind of navigating things with my job. Like, because caregiving did kind of then evolve into a bit of a full-time role for me. And I was working in consulting very long hours. So I was just like burning myself out. And I didn't really, I should have just been a lot more proactive with my employer about like my needs and to kind of like adapt things, because I just kind of continued to do work the right way. And I think that just like ended up with, me having done a lot of resentment towards like my employer for not understanding my needs. And then obviously then like just not like risking not being able to be there in a sustainable way for my mom. I think also just like the whole role of being like an advocate for her. Like I think I did a lot of good things with that.
What do you mean by advocate at this point? Talking with the medical team?
Yeah, and just like kind of speaking up a bit like on what I felt was important for her. Because obviously she was quite like fatigued and struggling with the condition and like side effects from treatment and all of this. So I think I did a good job in general at like informing myself and being able to speak up for her in these meetings. But when it came to kind of, for example, call nurses or doctors and kind of like demand things based on like new symptoms and stuff, these are things that like now with hindsight in mind, and for example with the work we're doing at PAL, I understand that I should have been a lot more direct and like almost like demanded more from the healthcare team, because we kept thinking like, oh, maybe this can wait until tomorrow, or like, let's call back on Monday, like it's a weekend, we don't want to bother them. So a little bit this like shy kind of, oh, I feel like this symptom is probably not important, like it's probably just part of having cancer. But then that obviously resulted in kind of her getting worse, and things always escalate in evenings and weekends. It's just a rule in serious illness for some reason. Like everyone is experiencing this. And I think like that is where I should have just like had more confidence.
Because how are you supposed to know? So
I wasn't. That's the problem, right? You're supposed, like you aren't supposed to know anything, because like most family members or friends who take on these responsibilities, how could we know like what we're supposed to do? And that is a little bit the challenge, that you're figuring things out as you're doing it.
We have been focused on more the role of the individual and the family. But if you look at it a bit more from a systemic perspective, what is the support that you get? I assume that, of course, it's different in every country within Europe. You went through this in Norway, right? So
Yeah.
I would think that that's one of the most advanced care systems where you can be, but maybe I'm wrong, you will tell me that. But what is the systemic level of support that you can or you should be able to get in a situation like this?
Unfortunately, it does really vary from even like family to family, condition to condition, country to country, like city to city. Like there is a lot of variation, because even in countries like, you know, the Netherlands, Norway, UK, like these are very like excellent healthcare systems where they have good supportive care and palliative care provision, which is like kind of the added support that you can get, for example, very often next to a cancer diagnosis, but also with other conditions. So the supportive care and palliative care is the kind of care that you can get that supports not only with the actual treatment, like the medical treatment you would get from, for example, your oncologist, but it helps you manage like your symptoms, your pain, and also the more like emotional and like practical aspects.
Palliative care is, like, first of all, I think many people who have not been through a journey like this don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think for many people who know what it is, it's a bit scary. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people associate palliative care with hospice, or really the end of, like the very end of life phase. How do you define palliative care, and what is something that people maybe get wrong about what it is?
Essentially, like, palliative care is the kind of like added support that you would get. So it, like, you're right that a lot of people will confuse it with hospice and end of life care, which is a bit of a shame, because there is a lot of taboo and like stigma around the word palliative care, if you've even heard about it, and that does stop a lot of people from accessing it. But really, what it is at the core is that it helps you with like your symptoms. So an oncologist, like when you're done with your treatment, like they will care, let's say you do chemo, and let's say that you have nausea, which is a very common side effect of chemo. They will help you and get you some pills for your nausea, for example. Then when you're finished with that treatment, you still have cancer in this situation, and you will then still have a lot of maybe symptoms from that cancer. You might have like late effects from the treatment, or you might just like experience a lot of other things as a result of kind of like your that it is a progressive and serious illness. So the palliative care team can then come in and help you with very specific physical symptoms. So whether that is continued nausea, pain, breathlessness, swollen legs, for example, like they have all of this support where they can really help you. And it really doesn't matter what your prognosis is, whether you're at the end of your life or whether you have a life expectancy of many years. They can help you with that whole like the essentially like the holistic needs that you have as an individual. So whether that is physical symptoms, emotional support, they can get you in touch with someone who can help you with spiritual topics. They can also
Only
help
the patient or the whole family?
both. Yeah,
Both.
they can also help family members with respite care, which is essentially like giving them a break. So that could be that, for example, the person who's sick can come and stay at a separate place for a few days, maybe just to give the family members a break, or they can send someone to your home and again, like give your family a break. And it can just help with all of these conversations that you might have and like talk about like preferences throughout like your life in general, but also towards the end and so on. So they really just put this like very holistic lens on it. So it's just such a shame that it is such a stigmatized term. And this is also why quite often a lot of palliative care teams have kind of expanded into calling themselves also supportive care, because supportive care is essentially anything you can have next to a serious illness, and it offers the exact same service, but it just doesn't have that term assigned to it.
Would you then basically suggest that someone immediately as they get a diagnosis, for example, they try to contact a palliative care team or support care team?
I think in an ideal world, I also think that clinicians should give very early referrals to supportive care and palliative care teams. You see this in more and more countries and areas that, especially in cancer, they are a lot better at it, where they do give an early referral to, especially then supportive care, essentially like alongside your cancer treatment. And you also see much better results and like patient outcomes in these populations that actually get that earlier. So getting access to supportive and palliative care, it literally can extend your life. It definitely gives you a better quality of life, like your symptoms are better managed, and so on. And it just has just such a big range of like benefits for both you and your family. So there really is like, in my opinion, there's very little reason why people shouldn't get this alongside the more traditional treatment and kind of like follow up with a specialist. And this is also what we see then, back to your question about around like how things are done. We see this in like really great areas or like places where they maybe have more resources in the healthcare system. But then in the like best examples, they do get a referral to then supportive care very, very early in their disease journey. Maybe not exactly at the moment of diagnosis, but very early. And in other areas where the provision of care is poor, which also in, for example, a country like the UK, that can also depend on your postcode, like where you live. It's not like just because you live in a country with a great healthcare system that you get access to the same kind of care, which is a shame because it really then is dependent on pure luck and your healthcare team and maybe you as a family and like your ability to advocate for yourself and request that support. But we also see in countries and areas with poor service that then they often don't get any form of access to supportive care or palliative care or even hospice care towards the end of life, which is a real shame. And it's really something that can then have very negative outcomes for patients, where it increases their chance of, for example, dying in the hospital, mismanaged symptoms towards the end, like a lot of pain and so on. And it's a real shame because with like modern medicine, there really, in many cases, like there is no reason why you shouldn't have well-managed symptoms throughout the course of your illness.
And why is that? So where does it actually go wrong in the process? Like in these cases, is there actually not a big enough team? So it's just not accessible, the support team or the actual support that the patient needs, or the doctor just doesn't mention it? Like, is it an organizational, operational problem? Is this an access or capacity problem? Maybe economically, it's just not worth it somehow for the local healthcare team to invest in building this out. So where is this going?
In many cases, it comes down to funding, that teams don't have big enough palliative care teams or they don't have enough hospice funding. There's also a bit of a lack of awareness even in medicine, where there's typically like generalist physicians that would often refer to a palliative care team. So this is also why you see like close link between oncology and palliative care, because there the awareness is generally high that people with cancer do need additional support. So you have actually very high referral rates to palliative care or supportive care where you get that. But in many cases, especially when patients don't have cancer, then it's typically up to either their specialist or their GP to give a referral. And quite often they will just wait too late to actually give that kind of support or to refer them to these kind of teams. And because of the kind of taboo and stigma, a lot of patients are not even aware that palliative care could help them.
So they don't ask.
So they don't ask for it. Yeah. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, but I think at the core it really comes down to funding and awareness.
The funding part really surprises me because I also looked a little bit into it, and it also makes sense that kind of keeping patients out from hospitals as long as possible. Yeah. It makes sense economically, right? It's still cheaper to, on a systemic level, it's cheaper to treat someone at their homes, even if they get support than not. So what if this is true? Then why is there not enough funding in palliative support?
Again, it's like a really mixed picture. Like, for example, we were some of the lucky people where, first of all, like my mom was ticking all the boxes. Like she had terminal, very aggressive cancer. So we then got like an immediate referral. But that was a little bit the case because they kind of couldn't really offer anything else. Like they couldn't offer like a lot of chemo and stuff like that. So I think that was sort of a bit the reason for that early referral. But in other situations with like the funding, like you're exactly right. Logically, it makes no sense. Like, yeah, it's correct that the better care you can provide for someone at home the more stable they are at home, the more likely they are to use other healthcare resources, and especially hospital resources, and especially emergency hospital resources, which are even more expensive. The challenge a little bit with this kind of support is that it kind of fits a little bit across the healthcare system. So just to use the UK as an example, the way that palliative care is provided there is that it can be provided a little bit in the hospital, where they might have like an inpatient team. You might then have a collaboration with a community palliative care provider. The GPs are often involved because not all patients need a specialist palliative care physician. Often they just need the holistic palliative care that also can be provided by a non-specialist palliative care professional, which can be a GP. It can be a home care nurse. It can be other professionals. So the problem is that it's a little bit fragmented, the care. And then it also becomes quite difficult from more of like a financial or like business case point of view to then say that the savings we can have in the hospital can be X, but we actually need to invest in these kind of like community resources, which is like GP and so on. So there's a little bit of a mismatch with like where the cost savings would be and where the care is provided. And that is what kind of makes it then a slightly less straightforward equation.
So it's fair to say that the issue is mainly bureaucratic.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. It's systemic for sure, like at the system level.
Summarizing what we discussed of the role of the individual and the family, I think the few key things that you have mentioned is for someone to make sure that they ask for the details of the diagnosis from their medical team and also the prognosis, and making sure that they have conversation about it in the family as well, and for the people who take on the role of a caregiver, that they know what it means. And that they are kind of prepared for it, and they have also conversations with the patient of, in given situations, what would they want to happen, as well as to contact palliative care teams as early as possible. Is there something I'm missing, or?
I think if you do all of that, I think then you're already a bit ahead of kind of the curve. You would then actually be quite likely to have better outcomes on your serious illness journey. This is really like what we see both in the research and what we hear from our users.
And at the beginning, we also talked a little bit about our other roles. So like that one person who becomes a caregiver also have other roles in their lives, right? They might be in a romantic relationship, they have friends, they have a workplace. So can you talk a little bit more also about how to deal with those other roles? Like I think many people don't realize that they are now not only those, but also a caregiver, and how you can kind of implement that into your life.
It's a great question, and probably one that I don't have necessarily the best answer to. But I do think that what can really help is to maybe start seeing caregiving as not necessarily something that is only for this week, like to kind of like look a bit ahead. That also means that you then need to be kind to yourself and not burn yourself out. Like you need to find something that can be more sustainable. And I know it can be hard because even if you may have gotten a prognosis, it's still quite hard to understand like how will my role as a caregiver evolve and how long will this be. I remember personally that was something I was struggling with because you're used to kind of being in control of things and you're used to kind of knowing when things will end. Like if you go on vacation, you know it's a 2-week vacation and then you'll be back at work. So it was quite hard to kind of know, like in terms of, especially with work, like managing like if I need to take time off from work, like how long should I take, and will that be enough, and what happens if I need more time, and all. Like it's very, very challenging. But I think first step is just to understand that this may last longer than you think, and that will be hard. But then you need to be kind to yourself. So it means that you can't just like burn the candle in both ends, and you need to start finding things that make it more sustainable. So, and this will look different for people, different people. So me, I had this whole, crazy like conversation with work when I finally got to that point where I could have that, where I was then able to make things a little bit more feasible for myself. For example, like in my case, it was to reduce like my client-facing role, so that I just didn't have to show up and be all peppy in meetings and so on. That was like really important. But it also included talking with my sister and like other people who were supporting us, so that I made sure that every day I had some hours outside of the house where I could just go and do something only for myself. So for me, that looked like really long walks in the forest, listening to like a podcast. But for other people, it would look like something completely different. But you shouldn't just like immediately stop like like don't stop like eating healthy, and you will have bad sleep, and you will stop going to the gym, and you will stop doing like anything that gives you any kind of joy. That makes it very, very hard to continue being a good caregiver and being there for your loved one. And that's the person you're doing all of this for. So I think just like being a little bit honest with yourself quite early, and even if it's just a few hours a day, just like trying to find like a little bit of a strategy to have that time. I think that is something that can just help like make sure that you can like keep going for a bit longer. Because caregiver burnout is a real thing, and it happens to so many people.
What does it mean, caregiver burnout, and what are some perhaps early signs that this might be happening to someone?
Where you might start getting depressed, you might start having anxiety, you will sleep worse, like all of these like standard signs of burnout. And it can be very hard in a similar way to normal burnout. It can then be hard to kind of bounce back from that once it happens. And that's why it's so important to actually try to prevent it.
That's such a good point as well, because I was thinking a little bit of, yes, I also know, and I think people in my life who are in a similar situation, they also know it's important to take care of themselves. But it's so easy to, at every point, just feel like, okay, I will, but this is not priority right now.
Yeah, not right now, yeah.
And right, like you said, I think knowing that there is a risk of burning out in it, but also thinking about it long term. I think that was really key. I said that this is now a long-term thing, probably, hopefully, in a way, and that you are not just making decisions day by day, but you are adjusting to a new life. Yeah. You talked about how to talk with your workplace or with your colleagues or friends, but what can they do? So in an, again, ideal scenario, when you're maybe not personally yours, but when a workplace finds out that someone in the team is in a similar situation, or in a friend group someone finds out that someone became a caregiver, how could they react the right way, or how can they be supportive?
Yeah, a great question. So first of all, I do want to say that so whether you are the patient in this scenario or you're the family member, I do think you shouldn't expect that your workplace or your friends or other family will just offer to help and just know what you need. In an ideal scenario, like they would, and there are ways for them to kind of be a little bit more proactive about it. But I think like the first step is really to just like not be like, we live like, depending on where you live and what your culture is, we live in a quite like individualistic society where we're used to being independent and doing everything ourselves. And I'm like that for sure, and I know a lot of friends and family are like that. But I think like this is just a time to just like don't be so independent. Like just ask people for what you need. It will just help you so much. That being said, I do think there's definitely a role for like employers and colleagues and friends and family. And I think with employers especially, I do think that they have a real responsibility when it comes to making sure that they can be a bit more proactive and suggestive with either their caregiving employees or if there are any sick employees. And there's a lot of great resources out there that will be much better than what I can offer. Essentially, like there are many different recommendations, like what should employers do. But it's just things like offering, for example, home office if that's an opportunity, maybe offering reduced hours. Also just asking the person more proactively, like what might they need, and also not assuming that just because you had one meeting, like don't assume that things won't change, because things will change, and maybe they're doing well now, and maybe now they're saying that they're coping with it, and that work is a welcome distraction, but in 1 month or 2 months, like things might look very different. So like don't just think that just because they were okay initially, because they hadn't come to terms with anything, but now they're still okay. And then with friends and family, I think just like being able to reach out regularly and showing that you're there for them, but also like maybe suggest like very specific things you can do. Because like maybe if someone would reach out and be like, hey, like I made extra dinner, like can I drop it off? Or like, hey, like are you going for a walk today? Like would you want me to kind of like accompany you on the walk with like over the phone or something? To just like come with like very specific suggestions can really help. And chances are like you're probably not suggesting something that they need, but that can maybe like at least make them feel like there's something more tangible, and maybe like they will be more likely to ask.
Yeah, these tangible ones are a great example. So we talked a bit about the individual, of course, and the environment. If you look at the systemic level, what do you think that should change there? How could we do better as a system, as a society, perhaps the government and healthcare systems, to provide better support for people with serious illness?
Well, first of all, I think we sort of touched upon a little bit, especially around funding. Like things really do come down to funding. So I think to just make like both supportive care and palliative care more of a mandatory offer that needs to be provided, and also define that in a better way, that it's not only more towards the end of life, because it's very like needs based, but these teams just don't have the opportunity to offer it in a broader way because they don't have the necessary funding. And I think secondly, to acknowledge the role of all of these unpaid family members. And by family, I also mean friends and like anyone, like neighbors, like anyone who's supporting. But there's so much unpaid labor in healthcare that is not recognized in any way. And they're also not getting any formal support. And I'm not saying that this should be like the treating physician or the healthcare team that should be responsible for this, because they obviously are there to focus on mainly the medical, and they don't even have enough time always to do their job. Like they're overworked, and we see this time and time again with stretched healthcare systems. But for there to be more support for all of this unpaid labor that really does go into making sure that people are able to stay at home, that they're able to get to their doctor's appointments, that they have someone there caring for them, like that is extremely important. And without all of this unpaid labor, like things wouldn't work. And you would see a lot more people in hospitals that are already filled to the brim, right? So I think those things would be really important.
Would that acknowledgement look like financial support, for example, for the labor that is unpaid right now? When you say acknowledge that, do you mean, for example, financial support?
I think in an ideal world, that would definitely be the answer. And you do see that in some healthcare systems, that they do actually have that. For example, in Norway, they do have that in some cases, which I think is great, because it does then allow people to actually then take some unpaid time off from work, but then they're at least compensated to some degree. At a minimum, I think it should at least look at like more formal support, so that people can actually feel more comfortable in their roles, that they know where they can go for support, and to offer respite, like the respite care that I mentioned earlier. This should be it, like at a minimum, I think.
It will again be a topic for another hour of conversation, but my assumption would be that most of the unpaid labor is done by women.
Yeah.
And perhaps that also people with worse financial background or just less income as a family, that they struggle more in this situation. Is that correct?
Yeah, when you look at the trends overall, yeah, definitely women. And quite often women have, caregiving responsibilities both up and down, in terms of both having kids and maybe elderly parents that they're caring for and so on. So you definitely see that. And for sure also when it comes to like the differences in socio-demographic status and so on, like at least if you look at like higher income brackets, like they can often afford to pay for additional support. So you definitely see that there's a lot of inequality that stems from this. And it also has a lot of like bigger effects, because then the more these people then need to take unpaid labor in order to actually provide this caregiving, and it kind of has a negative impact on both right now in terms of their salary and compensation, but also like long term in terms of pensions and all of this. So there's a lot of like negative results of this kind of inequality that we see.
Is there some positives going on? So perhaps any improvement that you see in this field, or innovation like you are doing yourself with Paul or other people, perhaps recognizing problems like you did and trying to advocate and fight for change?
Like you see this all the time, like, and I really do feel like that it is more and more on the agenda of healthcare systems, and supportive care and palliative care is also more and more recognized. So when I talk about the gaps, it doesn't mean that they're not being covered in a good way. Like in many areas, you can actually access very good support. It's more that it's just uneven and unequal, and just not done in the same kind of systematic way, where you don't know what kind of support you will get if you live here or there. And in terms of the people who are working in supportive care and palliative care, like these are the most selfless, amazing people that you will ever meet. So they are just doing an amazing job, and they're also working really hard on educating their colleagues who may not be so aware of like the benefits of palliative care and like when they could refer to them. So they are doing so much with so little. So I'm just imagining like what they could do with a lot more. And on the technology side, like we are especially like experiencing just like the benefits that are coming now with like AI being able to be like used as a way to just like supercharge our tools and the technology that we are building. So I'm also really excited to just like see like the effects of that, and how that can help people just access this kind of support like a lot sooner and with a lot higher quality than they can today. But that also does need to be coupled with like actual funding to these teams who are just working so hard. Like just one example of like one palliative care doctor that I spoke with, like he was working typically kind of like Monday to Friday, and then on the weekend what he did was that he was calling and following up with all of his patients just like on his own time. And you hear stories about this all the time where these clinicians are really like doing so much extra to be able to care for these people in the best way that they can. So it's simply unfair that they're just not getting the right resources they can to do like an even better job.
Yeah, and perhaps also just the right acknowledgement from society for how important their work is, right? Personally, I'm quite, maybe excited is not the right word, but seeing how indeed AI and technology might be able to innovate in this space as well. And I think or hope that perhaps this will also lead to human work being appreciated more. Like a lot of the work that we value now a lot is actually can be taken over by technology over time. But caregiving and nursing and a lot of things that right now are not valued so much by society are actually a lot more difficult to be solved with technology. So I'm hoping for a world where innovation also pushes us to acknowledge and to value the human work that we are doing. And I'm also curious about just in this aging society in Europe, where this will be even more and more and more big of a challenge and a problem, and it will also lead to more suffering with more people living with illnesses. How are we actually going to solve
we
that?
really need to take action now. Like we're already seeing the effects of an aging society, and with medicine getting better, people are diagnosed a lot sooner and are living a lot longer with all of these complex, serious illnesses, which is amazing. But it also then puts extra pressure on the healthcare systems and the clinicians that are already overworked and overstretched. So there's a lot of, I feel that urgency like very strongly in like my line of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex topic and scary, but also perhaps hopeful, seeing people like you doing the work that you do, or the doctors and healthcare professionals that you have mentioned. Do you feel like there is any topic or any important thing? Of course, we could talk about this for hours.
I feel like we really could have covered a few more hours for sure.
So, but anything that you feel is really important to mention in this context, and that sometimes maybe is overlooked or not talked about enough, and that we didn't touch upon?
I think maybe it's just to reiterate a bit what we kind of both said a little bit earlier in the conversation, that it's just so important to be able to like have these conversations, not only like when someone is sick, but also more when someone in your circle is going through something like this. And that can also be not just like a week after, for example, like a loss, or, it's also like to continue to have these conversations even when things are uncomfortable and just not something that you feel comfortable with. So I think anything that we as a society can do together to just like break down a bit of these taboos and like talk about serious illness and death and dying and also grief and everything that comes after, if we can like talk about that a bit more openly, I do think that just makes it easier for people, and it also does make it easier for doctors to help people, and I think it will have a lot of very positive effects. So it's great that we're having this conversation now and that we're both quite comfortable talking about these things.
Yeah, it's so difficult, right? Like I would think of like, how do you break down a taboo like this? But at the end of the day, I do believe that it's a lot on the individuals and our own agency, and especially for people who have gone through something like that and they know how valuable it is to try to break down the taboo. So I think that we are also trying our best to do it, but literally everyone who has gone through it themselves or knows someone can participate a little bit in breaking down the taboo, right? So thank you very much for helping break down the taboo and for all the work that you are doing. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad that we could shine the spotlight a little bit on serious illness. And I'm really rooting for you and your whole team and for Paul to accompany as many people as possible in this really, really difficult journey. You say that you are building something that you hope people won't have to use, right?
Yeah. Exactly. No, we really obviously like don't want people to have to be in a situation where they need our technology, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. And then we do hope that PAL can be like a good support and like a daily companion for the people who do need it. But I wish that we lived in a world where no one really needed it, of of course. Yeah. But thank you so much for having me. It was a really great conversation and I really enjoyed it.
Of course, thank you. And to our listeners, well, we also hope that you will not need to use Paul. But if you are in a situation that you are dealing with serious illness or that you have been through that journey, I and we really hope that you get the support that you need. If you feel comfortable with it, please share with us in the comments or reach out of what are the challenges that you are facing and how do you overcome that or what type of support do you need. And thank you very much for listening to this conversation. And please let me know what other difficult topics we should shine the spotlight on with Level With Me. Thank you. Bye. I never knew exactly why podcasters asked me to subscribe. It turns out it's all about the algorithm. Subscriptions, comments, and likes help this channel get noticed by new people. Reaching more people can build an audience, which makes a podcast financially sustainable. That means I can spend more of my time improving this show, and I have many ideas on how to do so. Please help me get there by clicking subscribe. Thank you very much.